Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we discuss research-backed strategies and techniques with recognized thought leaders that will deliver results that matter and create lasting change for leaders at all levels. Well, today I'm excited to be joined by Todd Henry, who positions himself as the arms dealer for the creative revolution. He teaches leaders and organizations how to establish practices that lead to everyday brilliance. He is the author of 6 books: The Accidental Creative, Die Empty, Louder Than Words, Herding Tigers, Motivation Code, and Daily Creative, which have been translated into more than a dozen languages. And he speaks and consults across dozens of industries on creativity, leadership, and passion for work. Thank you for joining me on the Good Leadership Podcast today, Todd.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thanks so much for the invite.
So excited that you're a guest on this episode. Love to kind of dive into creativity and really what got you interested in this topic.
Yeah, so we could go all the way back. I was born, no, yeah, so I actually grew up in a very rural environment. Not a lot of distractions around, not a lot of stimulus around, so we kinda had to make our own fun, and I think from an early age, I figured out that if I wanted to have any degree of fun in my life, I was gonna have to figure it out. I was gonna have to make it up myself. So, the closest neighbor lived about a mile away, and we got ourselves into all kinds of trouble. We tried to build a helicopter out of a lawnmower engine, like a working helicopter. We pretty quickly realized that it doesn't quite have the torque and the power to be able to lift us off the ground, but it was kind of fun, right, to play around with. And we did all kinds of really fun creative projects like that. And so then I went to school, went to college and studied marketing because it felt like kind of the most creative of the business, topics that I could study. Graduated from school, spent a little bit of time in the music business because I spent, put my way through college partially by performing music. So I was always kind of a songwriter and a performer. Spent a couple of years doing that, and then as the story goes, I met a girl, and she pretty quickly convinced me that music business, gainful employment, and marrying an amazing woman. You can have two of the three. You can't have all three. So I chose gainful employment, marrying an amazing woman. And long story short, I ended up as a creative director for an organization, very small creative team, but over the course of about a decade, grew that creative team substantially. And in the midst of that tenure as a creative director, I was really trying to figure out, how do I keep this team engaged and motivated and aligned? And started asking some agency creative directors in the town where we live. And they said, "Well, what do you mean? I mean, we just burn through people and bring in a fresh crop. That's what we do." And I thought, well, that doesn't seem quite right. That doesn't seem like the most responsible way to manage your team. And so I started doing a lot of research and experimenting with some methods to try to keep our team engaged, and they were working. And so I thought, well, hey, there are probably other people who want to know about this as well. So I started a podcast in 2005 called The Accidental Creative. And the idea was, let's talk about what it's like to have to go to work and solve problems and be creative every day under pressure. And apparently, I wasn't the only one who was interested in that, because the podcast very quickly took off and gained thousands of followers. And it's only really grown over the last 17 years that we've been doing it. And so that was really kind of the genesis. And then at some point was approached by Penguin Random House to write a book about the topics that I was talking about on the podcast. And so I did that. And that was sort of the birth of the consultancy, was when the first book was kind of being formulated. I realized, wow, there's a real need for this in the marketplace. This feels more like a calling than just a business or a job. And so I stepped out into that. And that's really what I've been doing now for well over a decade, is teaching leaders and teams how to be creative under pressure.
That's a great story, and I love that. And I love the book, The Accidental Creative. I try to read quite a few books to keep myself abreast of all the knowledge. This is one of the best books in this space that I've read, filled with practical advice and really a system that you can use and follow that over time is going to make you more creative, which is kind of where you start the book, is trying to dispel some of these myths around creativity. That there's this myth in the workplace that creativity is mystical, an elusive force that's somewhere between, like you said, the prayer and the US tax code on the ambiguity scale. So, but the reality is quite different, correct?
It is. So creativity is a practice. First of all, I think it's important that we demystify creativity, period. People conflate creativity with art. So they think, well, I'm not creative because I don't paint paintings, or I don't dance, or I don't make music, or I don't design things. That's for those people, the creatives. And that was kind of the genesis in some ways of the title, The Accidental Creative. It was that, listen, if you go to work and you solve problems every day, you're a creative professional because creativity is problem solving. And that means that you have all of these same pressures and dynamics that the quote unquote creatives, the traditional artists, have. And so I wanted people to understand that you can be intentional about practicing creativity, that you can build structure and, more importantly, infrastructure in your life to support your ambitions. And so that for me is the biggest myth that exists. You know, a lot of leaders or entrepreneurs or people who are analysts or people who are engineers, they think, well, I'm not creative. Are you kidding me? You are solving problems all day long under pressure with extreme constraints and very little possibility. You have to figure out how to make it happen. That is remarkably creative. And so that I think is the most important thing we need to do is frame up creativity as problem solving and understand that it is a practice that can be improved over time.
That's very encouraging, I know, to many people to hear that and to realize that versus saying it's just something innate that you were born with and either you have it or you don't.
Right. Well, and to some degree, talent, well, you can't discount talent, right? There are people who are 100% who are able to get to those creative ideas faster than other people, or they're able to have more of them because of the way their mind works. So that is 100% true that, I don't want to say like, well, everybody has the same creative capacity as Steve Jobs. Well, maybe not, right? Or Albert Einstein, maybe not. But we all have creative capacity that can be improved and leveraged to the best of our ability.
And that's so critical to note. You're right. I mean, just knowing that it can be improved, whatever your level that you're starting at, you can get better at it if you have the right tools and techniques. And I love the three things that you really kind of has as your, kind of your mantra for this book is you want to be prolific, you want to be brilliant, and you want to be healthy. And if you're that, then you're going to be producing great work consistently and in a sustainable way. Why did you pick these three? Or if you could unpack that a little bit more, that'd be great for our listeners.
Yeah, that was really the qualifier that I had when I was leading a team of people. I said, we have to do a lot of work, which is prolific. We have to be able to produce at a certain clip in order to be able to meet organizational demand. So that's non negotiable, right? The second piece, brilliant, we have to do good work. Like it doesn't do us any good if we're producing a lot of work and we're staying healthy, but we're not producing good work. We have to produce good work. So we have to balance how much work we produce with the quality of our work. So there's sort of an intricate balance there. And the third piece is healthy because what I discovered, unfortunately, over time through painful experience is you can be prolific and you can be brilliant, but if you don't get the healthy piece right, you will eventually lose the prolific and brilliant piece as well because we're not machines. We're not wired to function indefinitely like machines. We need rhythm in our lives, we need ebb and flow. And if you never give yourself downtime, eventually the net result of that is going to be your work will revert to the mean. You can produce a lot of mediocre stuff or a select amount of really good stuff. And so we have to figure out how to be prolific, brilliant, and healthy all at the same time in order to succeed in the marketplace. And so I have found for leaders, especially when I go in and I teach about leadership or leading creative people, this is a great dashboard to use when you're considering your team. Are we prolific? Are we brilliant? Are we healthy? Are we firing on all cylinders or are we missing maybe one or more? Is a great sort of dashboard, if you will, to have as you analyze how your leadership is going and also how your team is doing during a season.
That's great. In order to actually have those three, you have a great framework that you mentioned throughout your book and your research, the FRESH framework, which is an acronym for the 5 areas that you really want to focus on to have those three things in your life. But before we talk about those or unpack a few of those, like to just spend just a little bit of time on those tensions that are always in our work, whether you're a creative person or not. And you make the argument that everyone's creative to some capacity. We're always trying to, we're forced to choose between these tensions. And the three that you list are time versus value, predictable versus rhythmic, and then also product versus process. And I really want to focus on that first one, time versus value, because many people feel like it's the quantity, not the quality that I really need to focus on if I'm going to get ahead.
Yeah, this is a really difficult thing for a lot of organizations because the strange irony in many companies is we don't measure what it is we say we're actually going for, right? Our metrics don't line up with our aspirations. And so the net result is people are going to do what they're measured on, not what you tell them they should be aspiring toward. And the way this plays out often in organizations is we crunch numbers on how much time it takes someone to complete a project. We measure by hours, not by the amount of value that they deliver in the number of hours that they spend on the project. And so over time, what we train people to do is just to get the work done in as few hours as possible and essentially make it acceptable, but make sure that you get it done in as few hours as possible, because that's ultimately what we're billing, or that's ultimately what we're measuring as an organization. So this is that time versus value dilemma that we have as professionals. Creativity takes time. I always say that creativity is not efficient, but it doesn't waste anything, right? What I mean by that is it's not an efficient process. There's a lot of churn involved in in creating something. You're gonna have to play with ideas for a while. You're gonna have to connect dots. Stephen Johnson calls this exploring the adjacent possible. Play with ideas, connect dots, problem solve. Einstein called it combinatory play. You need to build some of that into the life of your organization in order to get to the true value. But if you're measuring time, often we don't allot enough of it for us to get to that real value. I had a great conversation with Adam Stelzner, who is the engineering lead at JPL for the Curiosity rover mission. And he said when they were trying to land the Curiosity rover on the surface of Mars, they were really struggling with coming up with a way to land this really delicate equipment on the surface of a planet, so far away, because, in the past they had used parachutes and airbags, which is fine, like if you're landing something that's not quite so delicate, but it wasn't going to work for this particular case. And so of course, their first solution was bigger parachutes, better airbags, right? Like that's always our first thing is let's just do bigger and better what we're already doing. But that wasn't going to work because of how delicate the equipment was. And so what they had to do was ask, okay, on Earth, if we need to transport delicate equipment, say there's like a Steinway piano and you want to get it from the top floor of an apartment in Manhattan and you want to transport it to another apartment, how do you do that? And they said, well, you would use a crane. You would take a crane, you would, connect it to the piano, lift it out through the window, and you would slowly lower it to the ground. And they said, well, what if we create a kind of sky crane, a vehicle that could hover over the surface of Mars and slowly lower Curiosity rover and then like cut the tether and go off and crash in the distance. And that's exactly what they did. And Adam told me, he said, what he learned from that process is you have to stay in the dark room. You have to stay in the place where you're not certain you're going to come up with an answer. Everything about you wants to gravitate to the first ray of light. Bigger parachutes, better airbags, right? The most practical, immediate thing we can do. But he said, you have to train yourself to stay in the dark room. And that takes bravery, especially when you see your window of opportunity closing. Now, in our case, that might mean we're missing a client deadline. In their case, it means it's another 17 years before Mars and Earth are this close again, right? So like you talk about pressure, that's pressure to solve a problem. So we have to train ourselves as leaders to be willing to stay in the dark room, to keep our team in the dark room long enough to get to the real value. Now, at some point we have to move. We can't stay there forever. But often we move too quickly, which is that time versus value tension. And we often err on the side of let's do it efficiently instead of let's create the value that we're being tasked with creating.
Oh, that's a great illustration on identifying that tension between time versus value. So you have these tensions that you always have to mitigate in the creative process. You mentioned there's some enemies as well that you have to be aware of that's going to get in the way as well. But I wanted to get into the FRESH framework, and that it's FRESH is that acronym standing for the 5 areas that you really have identified that people that want to improve in their creativity should focus on. And the first one is focus. Because focus, I believe, in this society, we're prone more to distraction. And you list two things that really kind of get in the way of us being able to focus. And that's one is limiting assumptions, and the other is the ping or distractions. What are some ways that you found to be effective that can get people to get more focused quicker, especially in this and age of where there's just so many distractions out there?
Well, the first thing is we have to define our work effectively. If creativity is problem solving, how we define those problems is really important. But most of us try to do projects, right? So we group our work by tasks, and those tasks are usually in buckets called projects. Well, our minds aren't wired to do project. Our ancestors weren't thinking, hey, look over there. There's a giant hole in the side of that rock. Let's invent a project by which we can make that a home for our family. They're like, no, we're cold. it's raining, we need shelter. That's a great solution. It's a problem waiting to be solved, right? So, what we have to do is ensure that every project that we're doing has a clearly defined outcome. So, we've defined the problem we're trying to solve. What does it look like when we actually solve this? And within that, there are probably going to be a subset of problems, also, maybe a number of problems that feed up into that main outcome. Why is this important? It's important because if we're working together in concert with other people, which we almost always are collaborating, if we're all doing a project, we might have a very different understanding of what the actual problem is that we're trying to solve with that project. Versus if we've all clearly defined the problem, as we work, the definition of that problem might change. We might realize, oh, we've learned something. We're not actually solving the problem we thought we were solving. Great, let's redefine the problem and let's take a different approach to this work. If we're doing a project, that means like a client's going to come to us or somebody inside of our organization and say, build me a website that, right? That's a project to do. Versus if they say, we're really trying to connect with this group of people. We really want to meet them where they are. We want to use technology that is consistent with what the kind of technology they're using every day. That's a problem to be solved. And maybe it's a website, but maybe it's something we haven't even thought of yet because we're not thinking in terms of projects, we're thinking in terms of problems. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have to tame the ping. As you mentioned, the ping is this perpetual pinprick in my gut that says, you should go check your email right now, or you should go check your Twitter feed right now. You should go check your Instagram feed, right? It's this constant sense that something out there might be more important than what's in front of me. Creativity requires synthesis, it requires patience, it requires staying in the present moment with the problem, persisting long enough for non intuitive connections to be made. If we're bouncing from stimulus to stimulus, we don't stay with our thoughts long enough to get to those deeper patterns, to see those deeper kinds of synthesis. So, one thing that's been very important in my life, actually, for the last couple of decades, is the very first thing I do in the morning is I get up and I go and I sit with my cup of coffee in the corner and I just spend time studying, thinking, writing, just journaling, just being alone with my thoughts. And here's the thing that happens often. I often have my best ideas during that time. Why? Because I'm not thinking about the email that just came in. I'm not chasing some other project I need to be working on. I'm just sitting alone with my thoughts. So few of us get alone with our thoughts. So few of us even know what we're really thinking, honestly. I mean, if we're really going to get down to the bottom of it, very few of us actually know what's on our mind because we're perpetually distracted. So we don't even know what we think about a particular idea or project, let alone, whether we should implement it. So I think it's important for us to tame the ping if we want to have proper focus in our life.
What I love Cal Newport in his book, Deep Work, and just really having that deep work requires that you focus for extended periods of time and prioritize it in your schedule because otherwise it's not going to happen. And you're right. We live in a distraction filled world. We're just in execution mode all the time. And having time for self reflection and deep thinking is critical if you really want to differentiate yourself.
For sure. 100%. Listen, especially I tell leaders this all the time. The most valuable thing you bring to the table is your intuition. It is, period. Full stop. Because you likely have experiences other people don't have. As a business leader, as an entrepreneur, whatever, you have experiences other people don't have. You have more dots to connect. So that means if you are not occasionally setting aside time to synthesize, to step back, to get alone with your thoughts, to synthesize and to strategize, you're failing a fundamental responsibility you have as a leader because your most valuable thing is your intuition. So you have to do whatever it takes to protect that intuition and to bring it to the table every day so that you can think clearly and deeply about the issues that your organization's facing. But so many people, so many leaders don't do that, unfortunately. They're bouncing from urgent thing to urgent thing, and they can't see the pattern within any of it because they're just so distracted by what's happening all day. So that would be, I mean, honestly, most of the time when people ask me for advice as leaders, it's usually they're saying, "Hey, how do I deal with this problem on my team? How do I handle this person who's being disruptive? How do I deal with the person who's always killing every idea?" or whatever. And I'll say, well, how much time did you have alone by yourself this week? Right? And what do you mean? That was no, no, no. First, before we do anything else, because as goes the leader, so goes the team. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you spending time alone in reflection and thought? Are you protecting your intuition? Right? It could be that you're so close to the problem that you aren't able to see the answer because you're not taking time to protect your thoughts and your intuition. So that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I think that's really how we reclaim focus in our life.
Great response there. So the next one is relationships. And I love the three suggestions that you give in this part of the model, and that, the key to cultivating creatively stimulating relationships is threefold. You want people that you can be real with, you want people or relationships in your life that you can learn to risk, and you need relationships in your life where you can learn to submit to the wisdom of others.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need all three kinds of relationships, right? If there's no one in your life who can speak truth to you, that's a problem. But a handful of years ago, I was speaking at Air University in Montgomery, Alabama, to a group of senior Air Force officers, and one of the other presenters that day was a U.S. Army general, and I got the chance to interact with him in the green room before we went on stage. And I said, "What's the most important thing I should know about leadership?" And before he even didn't even think about it. I mean, it was just almost like a prepared response. He said, "You need people in your life to speak truth to you before you realize you need people in your life to speak truth to you. By the time you realize you need it, it's already too late." I thought, wow, that is really profound because everybody knows we need relationships, right? But very few people seek out truth tellers and advice givers before they realize that they need it. And so you need to build that network into your life of people who can speak truth to you, people you can submit to in your life, but also people who inspire you. Do you have people in your life you get with and share ideas and bounce things off of, and who are building on your ideas? I mean, those are important people to have in your life as well.
You're absolutely right. The next part of the fresh framework is energy. Love this one because I think a lot of people don't understand its importance. Energy management, like you state, and I completely agree with, is at least as critical as time management. The real issue is not the number of hours we sit behind a desk, but the energy we bring to the work that we do and the value we generate as a result.
Yeah. So, we're great at managing time. We are. I mean, we have more tools than we've ever had in the history of humanity of managing down to the minute if we want our time and where it goes. But we are terrible at managing our energy. And the reality is, if we want to produce great work, we have to be able to give what Lewis Hyde calls emotional labor. We have to be able to put ourselves fully into the work. Unfortunately, many of us are going through the motions because we are so worn down by our schedule that by the end of the day, we have nothing left to give. We're just looking for the quick answer, the first ray of light, because we don't have any energy left to give. So, the first thing we have to make sure we're doing is ensure that we're not overcommitted, which means pruning, practicing pruning. What good thing in your life might need to go away so something better could be born on the other side of it, right? What good thing, not what obviously easily prunable thing, not what meeting that you hate, right? But what good thing might need to go away so you can create space for something better to be born in its place? I think it's a really important question for all of us to ask.
And I love what you state in the book too, that many people don't realize how strangling the cumulative effect of semi-productive activities can have. Which it's easy to prune the stuff you don't want. It's really difficult to to prune the next best thing, right? The thing that you really would like to do, even though you realize it's not going to add as much value as maybe what you're currently doing.
Yeah, I love a phrase that Scott Belsky coined. I think he's such a clear thinker about this whole thing. He calls it insecurity work, which I thought was a great phrase, meaning we're busy because we're busy. We're busy because we want to look busy. We're busy doing things because that's what busy people do. They do things. We're doing it because we're insecure and we want to look like we're productive, or we're afraid that if we try that really great thing and we hedge our bets and we put everything in on that really great thing, that if it fails, then we're gonna end up living in a van down by the river. So we do the next best thing because it's the thing that we can do. It's easier for us, right? So we temper our ambition, and that's part of it, I think. And part of it is just we say yes because we're afraid to say no. We're too insecure to say no, and so we just say yes to everything. And the result is we produce a lot of mediocre fruit instead of a select amount of great fruit.
And I love the quote too, that we shouldn't wear busyness as a badge of honor, but really it's a mark of servitude. So it's not something that we should really want to showcase, but more just we want to find areas where we can hopefully put forth the greatest value. And part of that comes with identifying the right stimuli, which is the next part of the model where, everyone knows you are what you eat. You're also what you think. And, I love the phrase, and I don't know who coined it, but I love to say that, some people have such open minds that, that's just everything falls out. I mean, you really need to be more selective and not have junk food coming into your body or your mind if you really want to produce great work.
Yeah, I think I want to say it's either C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton who said, "The purpose of an open mind is that it may close upon something," which I think is a great phrase. And the unfortunate part of it for many people is they have so much stimulus coming into their life, as you said, that they never take time to process any of it. It's just a constant flow that just rushes over them. I see people mindlessly scrolling Instagram. I wrote an article last week called "Avoid the Zeitgeist Blender." It's a phrase I have for basically how everything in our culture just kind of gets churned up in a blender and fed back to you via an algorithm. And you notice that after like the seventh or eighth time you see that video of the kid, you know, to the tune of "In the Air Tonight" by Phil Collins running into the garbage cans, and it's doo 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 doo, and he makes the noise with the garbage or whatever. Like the seventh or eighth time you see that, you realize like they're just like churning stuff up and feeding it back to me every 3 months. Like I won't even notice because I'm so overwhelmed with stimulus, right? That I can't see it's just being refed to me. The question for all of us is, what are you going to do with the stimulus that's coming into your life? I always encourage people spend more time with the source text, the source materials, spend more time reading fewer things and more time thinking about the application of those things, right? Think deeply. Don't just let stimulus wash over you. We think we're going to be more creative because we have so many things coming into our life, but those dots are not valuable dots for us if we're not thinking about them, if we're not processing them. So that thought time is just as important as having a practice in your life of absorbing that stimuli.
Can agree with you more. That's usually how I end every podcast. It's not what you know, it's what you do that makes a difference. And the goal of study is not simply to absorb lots of information. You need to be able to process it, assimilate it, and then apply it to your life because it's not what you know, it's what you do that makes a difference. And there's so many leaders, there's so many people that I know. I'm guilty of it as well. I read a book, it's a great book. It might be on a business topic or self-help topic. And but a month, 2 months, even a few weeks afterward, I'm hard pressed to find or to remember really what was in that book and really what I've applied, which is usually little to nothing.
Right. And that's, I mean, for me, that's really been convicting as an author, as somebody who writes books. I have committed that I've already mapped, I've got the roadmap for my next 3 books. And they're all going to be very short form factor. They're going to be smaller books that are easier to read and digest and apply, but they're going to actually be accompanied by programs to help you apply them versus just, hey, here's a 90,000 word book with a bunch of stuff in it. I hope you can do something with this, right? Which is what most books are. But if you want to really inspire change, it's all, like you said, it's all about application. It's about what you do with it.
Well, and I love that part of the book too, where you talk about notation, right? So it's really going deeper into those books, spending more time identifying ways to apply it, taking notes, reviewing your notes, and the type of observations and insights that you have throughout the day is something you normally don't put down on a notepad, but you argue, which I completely agree with. Those are some of the greatest insights, observations that you have that will build this creativity muscle over time, but they're fleeting. And if you don't put them down on some electronic or paper form, then you're likely going to forget them and not be able to benefit from those insights.
That's 100% true. Yeah, and we often think, well, that I'll never forget that, right? That's such a great idea. I'll never forget that. We need to discipline ourselves to write everything down. I carry an index card in the my back pocket because anything, any remote thing. I mean, if you look at those index cards that I carry around, they have random phrases, really strange words, like maybe the intersection, like two streets or something that intersect. And most people would look at that. And it doesn't mean it's gibberish to them, but to me, it means something. It's a prompt. It's a reminder of an idea. that I then capture and put in my notation system, and I go back and I review. And some of those little scribbles have become books, right? Some of them have become presentations that I've given to thousands of people. Because I'm trying to be intentional about capturing everything and not just assuming I'm going to remember it later.
Well, I'd be curious to learn your process on how you take something that you read and really, those steps of putting it down on paper, doing the note taking, and then applying it. I mean, is there a method? Is there a process, or are there technologies that you found to be effective? Because I know that's one question I get from so many people: is there's so much coming at me, I'm not applying enough of it.
Yeah, so a couple of things I do. First of all, I keep a note for every book that I read, and I have a place where I capture the key actionable insights from the book, so the things I'm actually going to do. And then I create projects out of those actionable items so that they don't become just like something I might do at some point, but they become actually incorporated into my life. So if I'm reading a book and it's like I'll give you an example. I read a book recently about the speaking industry, right? And I have a project, a to do that came out, or a project with to dos in it that came out of reading that book. Because I know if I'm just like, oh, that's something I should get around to someday, it's not going to happen. So I created an actual project around it where I immediately apply it. But the bigger thing I do for books that maybe aren't as tactical, practical is I use a tool called Readwise. It's great because it automatically imports all of my Kindle highlights, automatically imports other highlights that I put in there, and it feeds them back to me a handful a day, right? So I every day I sit down with my Readwise highlights and I review books that I've read, important highlights that I've captured in books from the past. And sometimes I realized like, yeah, that really wasn't as profound as I thought it was, and I just delete it. I'm like unashamedly will just delete things if they're really not as profound as I thought they were at the time. But for the ones that stick around, whenever they come around, it's like a real reminder to me of some of this wisdom that I need to be acting on. And the thing is, it's like success, right? Success comes in layers. Success is like not at all, not at all, not at all, not at all, then all at once. Is kind of what it appears like to the outside world. But the reality is, for most people who have some quote unquote big breakthrough, it's just the next logical step for them. It doesn't feel like some massive breakthrough. It just feels like this is just the next logical step that I'm taking. To everybody else, it feels like some massive, overnight success. But they don't see the years or decades of toil that went into it. And so people ask me, about book writing. How do you write a book? It seems like such a big project. And I'm like, well, I write 500 words every single day. And I do it a lot of days in a row, 5 days a week, for a lot of weeks in a row. And eventually I have a book. And that's not the answer people want because, like so many things, really what it takes is just consistency and commitment and a willingness to do what's necessary and make small amounts of progress even when it feels like you're not moving the mountain until suddenly you've moved the mountain, right? And it's the same with your study and your notation. So if you spend a little bit of time every day reviewing some of this captured wisdom, over time it just becomes a part of how you see the world. It forms your worldview in ways you don't even know, until suddenly you find yourself quoting like the C.S. Lewis thing from a little bit ago, right? Like it's like that probably is some quote that I read somewhere in some book that I've reviewed a handful of times, and it just becomes part of who you are.
That's so true, and I've noticed that in my life and others. There's a comedian that won America's Got Talent a few years ago called Terry Fader, and one person asked him, "Say, you just broke onto the scene. It's just your this overnight success," and he very quickly and responds to that by saying, "It took me 20 years of dogged hard work to become an overnight success. So what you saw was the end result. You didn't see all the things leading up to it that really meant that I was going to be this successful. Because, like you said, it's the next logical step. It's not a huge jump for that individual."
Yeah, for sure. And that's not an encouraging thing to people who are newer in their career. Keep hitting the same nail over and over and over and over again with a hammer, and eventually you're going to see progress. It's not something people want to hear, but that's really what it is. It's really just showing up every day and doing the things that are necessary. And over time, you build a body of work that stands the test of time.
Couldn't agree with you more. There's no hacks, there's no shortcuts, and it's a proven way to differentiate yourself. So in some ways, it's encouraging to individuals to say, if I could just keep doing it, if I know I'm on the right path, improving my skill sets, getting better with what I'm doing, then eventually I'm going to be able to make a difference and have a larger platform as a result. The final piece of the Fresh framework is the hours, and they're always your currency of productivity. Of the five elements you mentioned, this is probably the most significant pressure point for many creatives. And I love the insight that you give that all hours really are not created equal. We often overlook that 1 hour effectively spent can produce much better results than 5 hours is spent on a lot of frenetic activity. Like what I tell my son, it's you could do homework for 5 hours or 1 hour and probably accomplish close to the same amount. It just depends on your intensity.
Yeah, that's right. And so I like to tell people we have to think about our time the same way we think about our money. If you just spend your money, you're going to end up poor. You just are, right? If you spend all of the money that you make. However, if you disciplined and you set aside a little bit of it and you invest it and you let your money work for you over time, you're going to grow more money. That's just the way that things magically work. And if you're wise about it, I should say. And we need to think about our time in the same way. Some of it needs to be spent to do the things that need to be done in order to keep our job and keep our clients happy and whatever. But some of it, a portion of it, should be invested in things that may not have an immediate payoff, but that are investments in our future effectiveness. So that could be things like maybe for an organization, it could be like doing spec work, giving people permission to spend a little bit of their time doing work that doesn't that is kind of giving them permission to create and invent and think up new strategies and think up new ways that we might be able to approach the work. I mean, it's sort of the cliche thing at this point, but the Google 20% time, right? That sort of became the I know everybody has talked about that over time, but they talk about it because it was effective, because it yielded so many great products that all of us use today because they took talented people, they gave them permission to use their time to do things that nobody was telling them to do, and they said, "Go create value." And surprise, surprise, they did it. They created great value for the organization. And so, um, I think we have to consider how much of our time is being spent versus how much of our time is being invested on a weekly basis.
And like you said, we must learn to spend our time effectively rather than obsessing about efficiency. In your book, you have this great idea with idea time and the big three. And I'll let our listeners kind of look into that book to learn more about those. But before we end today, I love how you conclude all of your podcasts. I'm a big fan of your podcast. That cover bands don't change the world. And we've talked about this. We just talked about this a few minutes ago, but love for you just to kind of end on that, just to give people an idea that you can go for that quick fix, the hack, the shortcut, but you're not going to make a meaningful impact as a result of that, likely.
Right. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that I spent a big chunk of my time in the music business. And there were two distinct paths that people took in the music business. One of them was if you're a band and you want to very quickly get gigs and fill clubs, you would just play other people's music and people would show up because they're like, oh, I love the song September by Earth, Wind, and Fire, right? Or whatever, which is fine. But then the moment somebody came along and played that song a little better than you, like you lost your following because they didn't care about you, they cared about the music. And then there were other people who were like, we're going to play our own music. We're going to do our own thing. And you know what? They played tiny little clubs with like two people, who showed up for their show. And then maybe the next week there were four. And then maybe the next week there were eight, and then 16, and then 25. And then suddenly they're filling 100-person room and a 500 and 1,000. And you could see them over time. People with talent would grow that audience of incredibly loyal followers. Why? Because they couldn't get that music anywhere else. They were the only ones making that music because it was their music. And so when I say cover bands don't change the world, I don't mean there's anything wrong with being a cover band. If you just want to go make money and have fun, go be a cover band. That's fine. But if you really want to create something of lasting value that's really going to change the world around you, there's something you can do that no one else around you can do. And you have to commit to doing that thing, putting that thing into the world. And you can do both. The Beatles started as a cover band and then they evolved into an original band, right? They started as a cover band, but they didn't end up there. And that's fine because as you're learning your chops, sometimes the best way to do that's to imitate other people, to emulate other people. But at some point, you have to step out on the branch. You have to create your own thing. You have to find your own voice. So that's what I encourage you to do. Just don't be complacent and don't be satisfied with just copying other people. Try to find the thing that you are uniquely capable of adding to the conversation.
Love that. And thank you so much, Todd, for joining me on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Yeah, the best way is toddhenry.com. That's my personal site. You can find all my books, and the podcast is called The Accidental Creative. Since 2005, we've been delivering weekly tips to help you be prolific, brilliant, and healthy.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?